All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I see that a few folks have raised your hands. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it up in the chat box. So again, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on trauma-informed practices in shelters. My name is Avantika Shenoy. I'm the coordinator of the Training Institute at Freedom Network USA. Freedom Network USA is the nation's largest alliance of anti-trafficking service providers, advancing a rights-based approach to human trafficking in the United States. And we're really excited to bring this webinar to you today. So through this webinar, we have a lot of attendees, and with that, a wealth of knowledge and expertise. However, everybody is on listen-only mode other than the panelists, but there are multiple ways for you to interact with the panelists and as well as with each other through the webinar tools. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a black bar, and through this bar, there are different options for us to interact with each other. So one of the options is the raised hand feature. So the raise hand feature just allows us to get some immediate feedback or real quick feedback from you all. So let's just go ahead and check out how this raised hand feature works. So feel free to click on the hand button at the middle, so on the hand feature, yep. And I see a lot of you have raised your hands, so that's awesome. So we can utilize this for quick feedback throughout the webinar if necessary. And to lower your hand, you just have to click on the same button again. So let's go ahead and lower your hands. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So we are also providing closed captioning through this webinar. There is a CC button at the bottom of your screen. And oops, sorry about that. So there's a CC button at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to access closed captioning through that. And I will also be adding a closed captioning link through the chat box right now. So if you prefer opening up closed captioning on another window, if that's something that you prefer, you will be able to do that through this link. Finally, it's the chat box feature. This is the feature that we would love to have you all utilize so that we're able to constantly engage and talk to you through the webinar and get your feedback. So in the chat box, you can see that there are two features. And the two features are to send a chat to either all panelists or to all panelists and attendees. We understand that there's a wealth of knowledge and wealth of experience within everybody attending today. So if there's something that you would like to share about tools or practices that have worked for you in your community, please feel free to send that to all panelists and attendees. And also a few questions, because other people might have the same questions, right? However, if there are any questions that you want to just ask the panelists, by all means, feel free to select the all panelists option. However, whenever you think it's necessary, do try to use the all panelists and attendees option so that everybody is able to see that. So this webinar is brought to you by Freedom Network USA. The Freedom Network Training Institute is the training and technical assistance arm of Freedom Network USA. And through the Freedom Network Training Institute, we have the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. Through this project, we provide advocates dynamic and up-to-date resources on training and resources on housing options for survivors of trafficking. And we provide this through web-based trainings. We do bi-monthly webinars, and this is one of our webinars where we select a specific topic around housing and dive deep into it. We also have fact sheets available on our website. So is everybody able to hear me? I just heard somebody on the chat box say that they're not able to hear me. All right. Well, we'll work with you soon, Donna, to figure that out. Um, so, um, so as I mentioned, so we have fact sheets on our website as well as our resource library. I will be adding links to our website as well as our resource library in the chat box right now. So you'll be able to go on there and see the kind of work that we're doing as well as the kind of resources that we have. We also have technical assistance calls, which are paired with our webinars, and they happen generally a month after our webinar to talk about specific questions that came out through the webinars. We also provide one-on-one TA calls and TA to OVC grantees. So that is what we're doing through this project. Now that we've gotten all of that aside, I'm very excited to introduce you to our moderator today. Our moderator is Stephanie Bratnick, the Anti-Trafficking Services Director at Preble Street. Stephanie comes with a wealth of experience, and she's a trauma specialist and comes with a wealth of experience in crisis and conflict intervention. So she's a great person to walk you through this webinar and give you a little bit framing around trauma and talk you through the specific aspects of trauma-informed practices. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie, who will introduce you to our speakers and walk you through the rest of the webinar. So Stephanie?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here with everyone. And I'm looking, it looks like there's 400, a little bit over 400 people that have joined us and growing. So I think this is going to be a really special hour and a half together. Just as Avantika mentioned, I'm the Director of Anti-Trafficking Services at Preble Street in Maine. I am a certified clinical trauma specialist, and previously, before returning to the States as of last year, I was with UNHCR as a refugee protection and gender-based violence focal point, where I worked in the Middle East. And I also want to introduce our two speakers today. Peg, who is the founder and CEO of NASH, the National Alliance for Safe Housing. She has overseen multiple innovation programs providing safe housing options for survivors and families. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Pennsylvania, and she also completed a certificate in organizational development from Georgetown. And Elena is currently the director of residential programs with Womankind. That was formerly the New York Asian Women's Center. She provides oversight to the agency's 24/7 helpline, 2 emergency residential programs, as well as Pathways to Empowerment program that works with the intersection of economic empowerment, housing, and gender-based violence. I also want to take a minute and say that originally Rebecca from CAST was going to be our third speaker, and unfortunately she couldn't join us today. So if you saw her name in the registration email, apologies that she will not be speaking with us today, as much as she wanted to, and regrets not making it. So just the next slide, please. I think we can go forward. Thank you. So some very simple but impactful goals today that we want to make sure that we provide you with some good general knowledge and also some practical tools and skills that you can start implementing right away. One, what trauma-informed practices in shelters look like actually in practice, how shelters can incorporate policies and procedures that are trauma-informed, and trauma-informed practices in shelters can benefit survivors of trafficking. Okay, next slide, please. So we wanted to, before we launch into tackling those 3 goals, we wanted to ground the training in some basic knowledge on what trauma is, how it impacts the person who has experienced the trauma, and how it might relate or manifest in our clients. So I think, as we probably all know, we're coming. We're all working already with clients who have experienced trauma, and there's a wealth of knowledge among all the attendees that are signed on right now. So I want to acknowledge that, and if you have some pointers or extra information or extra resources or insight that you want to share, please feel free to use the chat box and put those additions in. We hope to have a really robust conversation. I want to start off in saying that, trauma we often refer to as this hidden wound or silent scream, because when we look at someone from the outside, it's not visible. We can't see it, we can't hear it, we can't feel it. And yet the trauma survivor does. It's very much inside of them, and it is an active, living, breathing part of their lives. It also is something that impacts and is innately primal and pre-verbal, and it speaks to us in that elemental place inside of ourselves that is beyond rational thought. So Judith Herman, this quote you can see here, traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. Judith Herman, if you aren't aware of her, really created and laid out the foundation of our modern day understanding of trauma and treatment. And I want to call attention to those last three words in that quote: control, connection, and meaning, which we're going to emphasize moving forward of how that manifests in our clients. This definition on the left side of your screen: trauma, exposure to any situation or event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope, is the definition. And there are lots of definitions that different definitions people use. This is the one that we're going to be running with today. And when we break that down a little further, we can see that it has these three very basic elements, which is one, there must be an event, and that event is an overwhelming experience where one is stripped of their power and control. Then there is the experience of that event. So the experience must be viewed by the person as traumatic. Sometimes that means that someone can experience the same event as someone else, and they can view it as traumatic, and the other person does not view it as traumatic. For instance, the death of a parent can be viewed differently by siblings. People fleeing persecution might view the situation differently. It depends on how an individual labels that event, how it assigns meaning or is disrupted by that event. It also depends on culture, availability of resources and social support, and the age of development. Then thirdly, there's the effect, the impact, which is the critical component when we're talking about the trauma response. And when we're talking about trauma-informed care or practices, this is what we're talking about as service providers: how we can understand, respond to, and mitigate the effects of trauma experience. These effects are not a choice by the person, and the person does not have control over those effects. I don't want to get too specifically into too many specifics about how trauma impacts the brain, but I think it's important to note that trauma impacts the area of the brain that controls our automatic reactions and systems, such as breathing and heart function, and it impacts directly our fight, flight, or freeze or submit response. And when that occurs, the brain automatically goes into that reaction, regardless if the situation is dangerous enough for us to go there. So there is a continuum of traumatic experiences, and it can come from multiple sources, such as a single event, a car accident, divorce, hurricane, prolonged violence, such as family violence, torture, environmental violence, complex, long history of multiple traumatic experiences or neglect beginning in childhood, systematic trauma, and then historical trauma. And I don't want to leave out since we are a group of service providers, the vicarious trauma as well, which is also referred to sometimes as the cost of caring, where providers can become traumatized due to serving or bearing witness to the pain, fear, and terror that survivors have endured. So what you see here is some of the common overarching ways that dysregulation of trauma can manifest. Trauma at its core, oh, sorry, next slide, please, Avantika. Thank you. Trauma shatters these general assumptions that we have about our world and our place in it. So while it does shake a person's belief in who they are, it also drastically shakes our core beliefs that we carry with us. That misfortune is not haphazard or arbitrary, and there is a person outcome contingency. So looking at Janet Bowman, if you don't know her, created the World Assumption Scale, and it looks at trauma's impacts, the benevolence of the world, meaningfulness of the world, and self-worth. So as you see here, psychologically, it changes a person's belief in themselves, as well as it diminishes a person's ability to trust. So people who are struggling with traumatic stress symptoms or diagnosis, they aren't able, their brain is not able to fire these things called mirror neurons, which we all have, these beautiful little neurons stirring around in our brains that when they fire, they allow us to feel empathy, identify who is safe, register signs of unspoken intention, and share our world with other people. So as a side note, you'll know when these mirror neurons are firing because you'll be filled with a sense of feeling in sync with the world. You might sit the same way as the person you are talking to. You might even say the same phrase. But the problem is that with someone who has had a trauma or is in a trauma response, these mirror neurons do not fire and the brain can hover in this gray zone. So when approached by someone or something that is new or out of the norm or might feel slightly chaotic, they will dive straight into this survival, fight, flight response. A client may also struggle with making decisions or taking action as their brain is frozen in this traumatic response and is simply existing in this survival mode. You may also recognize that they may struggle to follow through with goals or objectives that may they may have picked out for themselves, that in conversations they may have said, I really desire to make this happen, and yet it can be a hurdle to actually have people follow through on them. Importantly, there is this decreased sense of safety coupled with intense fear. This is really important because the impact of trauma traps people in a perpetual state of intense fear. Remembering, going back to this idea of shattered assumptions. You will know when someone is having a trauma response when there is a high level of dysregulation, whether that exhibits as hypo or hyperarousal. And we don't have time today to get into how that hypo or hyperarousal or that dysregulation actually manifests. That's for a different training someday. But next slide, I want to talk briefly about understanding the trauma responses in a trafficking situation. And remembering that it can look like polyvictimization, whether a person has children with the person who is trafficking them, and also what type of abuse is endured, and the type of trauma response that survivors will exhibit is going to be inherently linked to the individual type of experience they've had and whether or not they have any kind of previous trauma history or complex trauma from early childhood that can add multiple layers. Sometimes when we've worked with some of our clients may say, actually the experience of being trafficked was not the worst trauma that I have endured in my life. And that's important to note as well. And obviously the time frame, when did this trafficking occur, plays a very large role. We don't have time today to get into the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, but that is going to play a significant role in how someone manifests and the traumatic response, as well as the length of time in a trafficking situation. Again, though, the length of time really is attributed to how that person views it. We've had clients who have felt deeply shattered and highly traumatized by being trafficked for 10 days, and other clients who have been trafficked for years and may not have the same kind of response. Also, a cultural context is very important, and we're going to talk more about that as well. So in the end, I want to pass this on now to dive into some more specifics about trauma-informed care in shelters, to Peg. Next slide, please.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. Can you all hear me? Okay, well, I will assume that yes. So I'm Peg Haskelo, and Stephanie, thank you so much for that really well articulated explanation of what trauma is about. So we're going to talk a little bit about so what, sort of so what now what. What does trauma-informed care look like, knowing what we know about how trauma impacts survivors? So next slide, please. So the first thing we wanted to do was to take a poll among all of you, just to get a sense of how well do you understand what is meant by trauma-informed care. So you should have a pop-up box, and if you could just click on very well, somewhat, not that well, or not at all, and let us know how well you feel like you understand trauma-informed care. And I don't know, Vandika, if we have, there we go. So looks like we have a pretty good understanding of trauma-informed care. About 52% of participants who say they somewhat understand it, 42% who say they very well understand it, and 5% who say not that well, 1% not at all. So this is a good group. So I feel like I'm going to be speaking to some well-educated practitioners. So that's exciting. Next slide, please, Ivanica. Okay, so first we're going to look at just what do we mean when, at the basics, when we're talking about a trauma-informed care approach. And it's pretty straightforward. As Stephanie was describing in, what does trauma look like, and that it shakes a person's ability and belief in themselves and trust in others and ability to just feel like they have power and control over their lives. What we're trying to do through a trauma-informed care approach is to restore all of that, right? And we have to be able to do that in the space and the time that is right for each individual person and the way in which they experience trauma, because we know that that's going to be different for everybody. So at its most basic, what trauma-informed care would involve is a respectful, holistic, strength-based approach. So working with survivors of trauma to understand that they know themselves best, even though that knowledge or that belief in themselves has been shaken, and really playing to their strengths and helping them reconnect to the strengths that they have inherently to be able to take care of themselves, and helping them to prioritize physical and emotional safety so that they feel like where they are in that healing process is a place where they have physical and emotional and even social and psychological safety, so that they don't feel like they're going to experience additional traumas. We also want to make sure that we're using a survivor-centered, social change-oriented framework. So it's so important that as we're thinking about working with survivors who've been traumatized, that we're really putting them at the center of everything that we're offering and doing and designing, that our policies, that our frameworks are all about what the survivor wants and having them be able to drive that. But it's also more than just being survivor-centered. It's really using a social change framework, understanding that what survivors have experienced when they've experienced trauma happens in a context that is beyond just their immediate circumstances. And so how do we as advocates, as service providers, help to create change in that context so that further trauma isn't occurring? And we want to be able to emphasize empowerment. And naturally, we all talk about using empowerment in our programs, but really at its core, what we're talking about is helping to restore that power and control that someone who's experienced trauma feels that they've lost. And so how do we help them have power and control over their own lives? And finally, we just want to mitigate the impact of abuse and violence by restoring that choice and that control and facilitating connection and supporting coping and responding to victims' ability and to have a sense of identity and context. So we're really talking about coming to trauma-informed care work in a holistic way that is addressing the whole person and helping them reconnect with their strengths and their sense of self. Next slide, please. So this is trauma-informed care is a question that has been sort of tossed around since the early 90s. There's been an evolution of what it means to be trauma-informed, and there's been a number of different sort of conceptions and definitions, as Stephanie mentioned, of what is trauma and how do you effectively treat it. In 2012, the Department of Health and Human Services came out with an outline for the 10 factors, the 10 guidelines that they believe go into providing trauma-informed care. And this is relevant, I think, because it's HHS that administers funds for domestic violence shelters. And so these 10 factors are guidelines that they recommend all of their shelter grantees employ in working with survivors who've experienced trauma. So let's talk a little bit about these guidelines. The first one is safety. Oh, and let me back up as well by saying that when we're talking about trauma-informed care in the context of a shelter or really any service organization that's working with survivors of trauma, all of these guidelines should be applying to the organizations we're talking about, as well as to the services and the treatment that's given to trauma survivors. So you'll see what I mean in a minute. When we talk about safety, we're talking about safety throughout an organization. So that's safety that applies to not just the survivors who are accessing those services or that shelter, but also safety for staff and for the people who participate within that organization and everybody who interacts, so that they have a sense of physical and psychological safety and understand that their interactions are promoting a sense of safety. So it's safety across the board. When we talk about trustworthiness and transparency, we're talking about making sure that organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency, and that there's a goal of building and maintaining trust among staff and survivors, as well as community members and other people that are being served by the organization. So again, we're working to ensure that there's trust and transparency throughout the organization. As well with collaboration and mutuality, that there should be a sense of true partnering and leveling of power differences between staff and clients, so that organizational staff and direct care staff and administrators are all feeling like they have, a contribution to the organization and to ensuring that the people that they work with have that same sense of partnership in the care that they receive, and that's how healing happens, in that leveling of power. As well as with empowerment, that the organization and clients that are served, that their strengths are recognized and built on, and that, they might be assisted to receive new skills as necessary, but that, again, that sense of empowerment, it exists within the organization where the services are being offered. It's the same as well with resilience and strengths-based services, that there's a belief throughout an organization in resilience and the ability of individuals as well as organizations and communities to heal and promote recovery from trauma and build on what clients and staff and communities have to offer, rather than responding to, say, perceived deficits. When we talk about peer support and mutual self-help, obviously that really goes to the heart of organizational operations, and making sure that services and service providers have the ability to share the work that they're doing, and that it's understood that peer support is a key vehicle for building trust and establishing safety. When we talk about inclusion and shared purpose, we want to make sure that the organization recognizes that everyone has a role to play in a trauma-informed approach, and that's from the top administrators down to the frontline staff, but that everyone has an essential role to play. And you don't have to be a therapist in order to be therapeutic when it comes to addressing trauma. When we talk about cultural, historical, and gender issues, we want to make sure that the organization is addressing cultural and historical and gender issues actively, that they're considering the biases and the stereotypes and the kinds of social contexts that contribute to ongoing trauma and disempowerment of people, and that the organization is seeking to address that both throughout the organization and within the community that they operate, as well as to address that with survivors. And then the change process is a conscious process, right? That we understand as we're working with trauma survivors that change is constant, and we want to be intentional and ongoing about it. So the organization that is treating trauma strives to become a learning community that's constantly responding to new knowledge and developments, and understanding that process, and including and empowering the staff who are part of it. And then finally, voice and choice. And I imagine many of you are familiar with this concept, but that the organization aims to strengthen staff, survivors, family members, everyone who participates in services and interacts with that organization, that their choice is recognized and their experience is unique, and that services can be offered in an individualized way. So these are the 10 guidelines that HHS put forward for shelter practices, and we believe it's a good baseline for understanding what's meant by trauma-informed care. Next slide, please. So there has, as I said, been an evolution of trauma-informed care throughout the last few decades. A couple of examples of that. One is within housing programs. So the Housing First model that was developed in 1998 was really designed initially to support services for individuals who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And it was designed to ensure that those individuals could access housing immediately before having to have whatever issues they brought with them addressed. But the idea being that you put someone into housing first before you address whatever trauma or other issues they have. So the principles there really focus on providing immediate and low barrier permanent housing, helping people get into permanent housing quickly and without obstacles, that there's not a prerequisite for good behavior. So housing is not a reward, it is a right. And then providing those participants with wraparound services to help them heal. And that includes from trauma. So that's what the Housing First model in homeless services looks like. Next slide, please. And then in 2018, there was a study that was done that was based on a model developed by Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Goodman called the Trauma-Informed Practices Scale. And that study called Evaluation on the Effects of Receiving Trauma-Informed Practices on Domestic Violence Shelter Residents really spoke to when organizations that are providing domestic violence shelter employ good trauma-informed services, that it has an immediate improvement in the self-efficacy and safety-related empowerment of survivors, so that they have a much increased sense of ability to mobilize and take care of themselves, achieve the goals that they want for themselves, and help them feel safe and be able to move forward with their lives. So next slide. So the trauma-informed practice assessment scale, which, as I said, was the basis for that study, essentially took many of those 10 guidelines that were developed by HHS and reduced them into 6 areas that the researchers felt were really essential to address, again, within the context of the organization, as well as through their services in providing trauma-informed care. And those 6 elements have to do with the first being functioning in an environment of agency and respect. So when we say an environment of agency, we're talking about making sure that staff and survivors have a sense of their own autonomy and their ability to make choices that they believe are good for them, and that those choices are respected. These organizations also have an emphasis on strengths, and again, this applies both to staff as well as survivors, but it really is about pulling on that resiliency of people to be able to bounce back from traumas, either vicarious trauma or other kinds of trauma, to be able to move forward with their lives. That there's access to information about trauma. So we know that when people have experienced trauma and they are trying to just make sense of their world, that it helps to understand what trauma is about, how it impacts people, and how it might be impacting either you as a survivor or you as a staff person, so that you can help incorporate that into your coping with the trauma that you're experiencing, as well as providing services for trauma survivors. The organization offers cultural responsiveness and inclusivity, and so this is so important, particularly for survivors who are coming from culturally specific backgrounds, where their trauma might look very different from, say, trauma of other survivors that are accessing programs. And there has to be a respect for that cultural context and how trauma and coping might look within that cultural context, and making sure that it is honored and included. There has to be opportunities for connection, and this is, again, a huge piece of being able to help survivors be able to reconnect. As Stephanie mentioned, trauma really destroys a person's connectedness with their environment, with their social and emotional supports. And so helping them to reconnect is essential. And then this scale included a third or a sixth aspect, which is support for parenting. And recognizing that so many survivors who come into specifically domestic violence shelters who are bringing children with them, that there's an opportunity for them to parent their children in the way that they believe is best, and that there's support for that within that organization. Next slide, please. So what do program elements that involve trauma-informed care look like? Well, obviously, there are a lot of things that we've already touched on, but just to get a little more specific, and I'm not going to go through each and every one of these because I think you all have a sense of how the kinds of guidelines and best practices that we're discussing would impact these things. But just to give you some examples, Stephanie talked about goal planning, and in many domestic violence shelters, goal planning is a standard case management process, right? You sit down with a survivor and you talk with him or her about how they're going to find housing, how they're going to get a job, how they're going to access legal supports or take care of their children or whatnot. But understand that if you're working with someone who has experienced trauma, that goal planning could be challenging because the trauma may have impacted their ability to, as we mentioned before, it might inhibit their ability to plan and think about goals. Even if they're goals that they willingly say that they want to pursue, that the trauma may interfere with their ability to actually follow through on goals. And so that's really important to remember, especially in a shelter context. If you're considering doing information and referrals to connect someone to community services and you want to get a release of information, remember that that lack of trust and that sense of fear that someone who's experienced trauma has. And you really, if you're acting in a trustworthy and transparent way, you want to make sure that the person you're working with understands why you want a release of information, understands the length of time and how that release of information is going to be used, and that they have the ability to withdraw that release of information at any time. And it's processes like that that will help rebuild and develop trust between you and the person who may have experienced trauma. If you're considering your eligibility and access criteria, you really want to think about employing a low barrier model because if trauma survivors are in need of shelter, if they're in need of emergency safe housing, then they may not be able to advocate for themselves or go through a lengthy qualification process or consider various eligibility criteria for how to access shelter. What they need is immediate, safe housing, and whatever issues they may bring with them, you should be able to address those issues once they've come into shelter. But really consider making that process, as well as your intake process, as easy to get through as possible, because folks who have experienced trauma are not really thinking about, say, all of the rules and expectations that you're going over with them when they're sitting there with you signing a mountain of paperwork in order to have safety and shelter from whatever violence they may have experienced. And so it's just very important to, again, do this in a way that is that offers space and time and allows the survivor to go through that process in their own way when they're ready to take in that information. The same thing with data gathering. You really want to be as open and transparent about the data that you're collecting on those survivors that you're working with, and make sure that they understand why you're collecting the data that you are and what it is that they can do with it, that they have a right to understand, to read their files and to withdraw whatever information they want, as well as to understand that they don't have to provide certain kinds of information just to access shelter if they don't want to. And so that really needs to be, again, within their own space and time. So I think that gives, and then making sure, I guess, finally, that you have partnerships with other organizations and advocates within your community so that you are able to begin addressing that social change element, so that you are working to impact the kinds of biases and oppression or, you know, conditions that give rise to trauma in the first place. So the next slide, please. Okay, so I think I'm going to hand it now over to Elena.
Thanks, Peg. So my name is Alina. Again, as Stephanie said in the beginning, I'm the director of our residential programs here at Womankind. And so as a part of that process, I do oversee 2 emergency shelters that are part of the Womankind community. And so before going into detail, I'll provide details about the logistics of our program a little bit later on. But I wanted to start with kind of going into what are some benefits to kind of incorporating a trauma-informed approach within a shelter model. Next slide, please. So as Peg and Stephanie mentioned in the beginning, trauma and its impact really creates a rupture in trust when an individual is experiencing it. So a lot of the times, whether you're engaging in practices in a residential setting or in a community setting, it's important to account for how trauma has had a deep impact in somebody's life and how, as a result, a person's well-being is impacted in a deep and meaningful way. And so a lot of the supports that we're trying to provide or build out to support survivors who've experienced trauma needs to account for that fundamental shift that's happening in a person's well-being. So as a service provider, Womankind's advocates and all of us in doing shelter work focus at the foundation in reestablishing the trust. And when we're reestablishing trust is when we can kind of really have a deep, meaningful, and authentic relationship with the residents that come in through our program. And then once we have that, we're trying to define self-sufficiency based on the needs and what the person sees as self-sufficiency, right? Because I think everybody has a different understanding of what self-sufficiency can kind of stand for them in their lives, for their family. And so our goal is not to have necessarily a specific understanding of self-sufficient means you are able to go to work, for example. But self-sufficient really is, what is it that you think that you would need to be able to feel somewhat like you're moving forward from whatever trauma you've experienced. And then when we're creating spaces for emergency shelter, when we're creating the environment in a welcoming way, recognizing that it's short term, but if we're creating environments that are welcoming and transparent, and as well as offering a wealth of resources and a menu of services, what we're doing is creating opportunities for survivors to try to kind of figure out what are ways that they want to start in their healing journey. If we also create practices that limit re-traumatization, so when we're looking at a lot of our policies, procedures, and structures that we've created in our programming, does it account for the principles of trauma-informed, where there's safety, where there's the ability for transparency and trustworthiness to be present? Is there collaboration, or is there mutuality, choice, and empowerment? Those are components that every single component of building out a shelter space would try to account for these trauma-informed principles. Next slide. So in terms of thinking of best practices, one of the things that I think we all want to try to engage in our work at the forefront is to assume survivorship. So we assume that a lot of our survivors have experienced trauma, and as a result have negotiated their spaces or their lives with that trauma experience. So they are the experts in navigating what does it mean to stay safe, and how is it that they're going to stay safe. And so when we're coming as advocates doing this work, we're recognizing that to be an assumption that we would make in doing work with clients. And in order to do this work, I think Peg mentioned this before, we want to try to create a level of parity between the dynamics of the advocate and the survivor. So we're recognizing that as trauma has existed in this person's life, power and control that this person at one point in time experienced or had access to as a result of the trauma is not necessarily there. And so when we come in as advocates, sometimes we are assuming a role of authority because we're service providers, or we're negotiating different frameworks where we give access to survivors information, resources, or whatnot. So that in itself has an inherent authority attached to it. So when we're trying to do work with survivors, what we're trying to create is partnerships that we're allies with them, and that it's not necessarily what we would like to do that we're going to move forward with, but what is it that you and I could do together to navigate your goals for your life going forward. So there's a lot of trigger points also that comes into play when it comes to experiencing trauma. And so everybody's trigger points and triggers are going to look different. And so a part of what we do within our organization as a part of the intake process is kind of getting a sense of what the inventory of what triggers are already present that the survivor is aware of. And sometimes this happens over a prolonged period of time. So intake for us is never going to be one session. It's a series of sessions where we're trying to get to know each other, trying to establish trust. And within this, what we're doing is trying to come up with, okay, we recognize that these are trigger points. These are some solutions that you've already put into play to help you navigate that. Would you like the rest of the residents, the rest of the staff in the house to be aware of this so they can better support you should this trigger come into play, for example. We also will provide information about trauma and abuse, but one of the things that we negotiate as our program is we are an API specific, so Asian Pacific Islander specific organization. So we do speak about 18 plus languages within the Asian, Pan-Asian community. And so that means information and language around trauma and abuse doesn't easily translate into the other languages that we speak. So we spend a substantial amount of time breaking down contexts that are English in understanding trauma or neurobiology of trauma into languages that our communities speak, which sometimes means that the word trauma won't exist, but we would have to explain it and contextualize it in order for survivors to try to understand how trauma has really truly impacted the world that they're living in right now. That also means, I think sometimes people think shelter is synonymous with very, very rigid, strict programming, but what we've seen is that flexible programming, flexible policies and regulations and services that are individualized to the specific needs of that family or that individual that's coming into that program can kind of support them truly finding their own healing journey within the space of a shelter environment. The other thing that we want to do is recognize that we as an organization maybe don't have all of the access to all of the different resources that may be helpful for a survivor. So a lot of what Womankind is focused on is who are community members that can be potential resources to access for building a support network or a connection network for this survivor to then continue in their healing journey. And then, of course, it goes without saying, this work is super difficult, and engaging in self-care is not only a process that we would encourage our survivors to go forward and kind of explore for themselves, but we also encourage that as ourselves, as advocates who are doing this work. And so that means not only practicing in self-care techniques that kind of help us rejuvenate or find well-being, but it also means that we're constantly learning and constantly growing to enhance our skills, and mirroring techniques so that survivors can kind of learn new techniques along the way of their healing journey while they're staying with us. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand it over to Peg, who's going to talk a little bit more about the worst practices we could consider in terms of trauma-informed care.
Okay, so as you all, I think, are beginning to gather, there are a few things that you probably shouldn't do when you're employing trauma-informed care. The first thing is to ask what's wrong with you. Really, what you want to frame it is to ask what happened to you, because again, we're trying to focus on a person's strengths and the event that they may have experienced that caused trauma, rather than the deficit that they may feel brought on trauma. So you don't want to assume that survivors all experience trauma the same way. People are all different, and the trauma is going to look different for different folks. You really don't want to take away their power and control. Again, this is about helping to restore their power and control and give them a sense of agency over their lives. It's important not to violate their privacy or their confidentiality. Again, this speaks to building trust with survivors and making sure that, that you are honoring their trust in you. And you also don't want to use interventions that might result in shame or humiliation. Don't require someone to have to tell their story if they're not ready to, or to talk about what happened to them in a group setting or with people that they aren't comfortable with. Those kinds of interventions would be damaging. You also don't want to assume that you know what survivors want. It's so important to find out from them directly what it is that they want, and let them tell you multiple times if necessary, so that you can give them, again, that sense of agency. Don't generalize about survivors' lives or their thoughts or feelings. Don't think that just because you know a little bit about trauma and trauma-informed care that you know what trauma looks like and how it makes people feel. Again, it's important for them to be able to share that with you in their way. So you don't want to rely on one-size-fits-all programming or protocols. This is, again, about really offering an individualized service and approach so that survivors have the space and time that they need to heal. And you don't want to coerce survivors to take actions that they don't want to take. But so you get the idea that this is really about allowing survivors to drive their experience and take back the power and control that they've lost, and help provide them with the support and the services that they need to move forward the way that they want. Next slide, please. So naturally, that can be challenging. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges of trauma-informed care and practices. Next slide. So in terms of the organization, it can be challenging to provide individualized, flexible services that are empowering and that are, imbuing trust and safety for survivors. When you're trying to maintain boundaries and set limits, if you're working in a shelter context where you have a lot of people living together in a close space and you feel that you need to have limits and boundaries to be able to manage that, it can be challenging to do that as well as to offer trauma-informed care. It can also be challenging because survivors may exit programs prematurely or defy, what you believe would be the best advice. Because again, they are trying to manage their lives as best they can, and they may not believe that either the services they're receiving are helpful or they may have other ideas for things that they want to pursue. Survivors may have difficulty establishing trust. And so if you're trying to offer them services and saying, trust me, you can, we will help you, you can't automatically believe that survivors are going to do that, that it's going to take time for them to build that trust. You have to be able to be patient to wait for that to happen in the survivor's own time. You also need to understand the length and unevenness of the healing process because, again, this is going to look different for everybody. Some folks, it'll go longer than others, and it's, some folks don't heal, many folks don't heal in a linear way. So it's not like they come into a program and they are traumatized, and then with just the right amount of time and TLC, they will be fine and move forward. For many survivors, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And you have to be able to be there consistently for them to help support them and sustain that support for them. It's, as many of us have mentioned at this point, vicarious traumatization within yourself and within your organization is an occupational hazard, right? Doing this work can be really challenging. Hearing the stories of the survivors and the trauma that they've experienced can be really draining, which is part of the reason why it's so important for your organization to have those same trauma-informed care practices built within your organization throughout, so that you have the ability to talk to other people and get support from your supervisor or process whatever it is that you have experienced in working with the survivors that you have, so that you don't burn out immediately. And a lot of times, it's okay if you burn out too, and taking a break from services and then coming back to them is perfectly fine as well. And finally, understand that there are often systemic or organizational barriers to survivor safety and their well-being and stabilization. And that can be really challenging when you're trying to provide services in a way that's flexible and individualized and empowering for survivors, when there are expectations within systems that there has to be certain kinds of documentation or reporting or progress or outcomes. Trying to do things in a way that is not always consistent can be challenging. So it's worth the journey, but it can present its barriers. Next slide. And now I'm back to Alina.
Thanks, Peg. So I was asked to give a couple of examples of how trauma-informed implementation within shelters kind of sometimes can also be challenging in certain ways. And so for many of our shelter providers who are out there now attending this, there are limitations of stay in shelter, right? For us, the maximum stay a person can kind of be with us is about 180 days, so about 6 months. But that doesn't mean they're only guaranteed 90 days, right? And after that, there's some sort of extension process that we would have to engage with our local county to then continue to extend the stay going up to maximum of 180 days. So this can sometimes create challenges in the sense that it kind of puts a limit of time that you are now interacting with a survivor and going through the trauma process with them or the healing journey with them, but now you have 6 months that you can do it with. So this is problematic, and one way we have overcome this or tried to kind of account for this is our services continue past shelter. So if you've decided if your stay with us has been has ended, you can go into a program we call continuing care, where we will continue to work with you and provide services with you wherever you go past our specific or physical shelter space. The other set of limitations that we experience is we do have city and state guidelines and regulations that we would follow in terms of how to operate, quote unquote, a shelter facility to the standards of the city or state guidelines or regulations. And so this sometimes means that we are disclosing information of survivors with or without, previously it used to be for us that we would have to automatically disclose the survivor's information because of the way the system is set up in New York City. But what is happening over time is there's an acknowledgement with our county and with our state of how this can releasing of personal identifying information without proper consent of a survivor really kind of creates trigger points. 1, 2, it's against the Violence Against Women Act regulations, the law, right? So there are steps that the city and the state have taken to kind of begin to account for informed consent and to make sure that a survivor is fully aware of the information that, like Peg said before, that information that is being shared now with another government entity, for example, and they can consent to disclosing that information or choose not to, and that's completely okay as well. We are still working with our county. I think there's still concerns that are developing within the state of New York where there's information that's being disclosed about survivors or limitations that are being drawn towards survivors where information about them and their trauma and their personal identifying information and even immigration status is being asked. And so there's constant back and forth that we negotiate in terms of challenges to kind of really account for trauma-informed practices means that we are really trying to protect the information of a survivor by holding it with the survivor and the survivor themselves. The other layer of challenge that we experience when it comes to the city and state is audits and site reviews. So we go through a very rigorous process of an audit that happens annually, and then sometimes there are impromptu, unannounced site reviews that actually happen as well. But some of the challenges we're experiencing is our shelters are sometimes treated as youth group homes. And so the rigidity and the structures for group homes don't really translate well within a DV facility. And so being regulated by that process or as if we were a group home creates a lot of challenges and a lot of privacy issues for the residents. So there's a lot of advocacy that we engage in with city and state regulators to kind of account for increasing the privacy of an individual that's residing with us. The other layer of challenges that we experience is around confidentiality. So we are asked as a part of our regulations to keep our sites confidential. That means we're not sharing information about our location with other entities, and we ask that residents do the same thing. Now, in practice, this is incredibly difficult to maintain because survivors are negotiating so many different challenges as they're coming into a shelter environment. They have to maybe negotiate childcare issues when it comes to visitation or child support, which requires court information where disclosures can potentially happen unknowingly. Sometimes there's information that is somehow channeled to the adverse party and somehow they locate the individual or the survivor within our shelter space. So those are when we kind of insert a policy called safety alerts, where we're kind of creating support channels where we're safeguarding the individual that's residing in our house, and we're also putting a set of policies and procedures in place to kind of account for the well-being of the entire house unit at that point. What we're negotiating in New York City, given the current climate that we're living in, is a lot of law enforcement entries and sometimes ICE. There's a lot of threat of ICE entries coming into shelter environments. Now, and early on of last year, there was the threat was a little bit more heavy for us, and so we came up with different protocols and different strategies to kind of keep ourselves safe in the sense of understanding what is considered a valid warrant versus a court order, and at what point are we obligated to let law enforcement or ICE officials into our space. So those are trainings and structures we've created to kind of account for that, because law enforcement entry into a shelter space is not going to be always helpful, and it actually creates an incredible amount of triggering for not just the survivors living in that space, but also for the staff that are kind of negotiating the work with that law enforcement person. Next slide, please. So given what we've talked about up until now, I wanted to present to you a model of practice that we use within Womankind that accounts for everything and anything that we do. And at the basis of it, it's a marrying of trauma-informed care, relational theory, and strengths-based practice. And so why we've done it this way is because we wanted to create a clear foundation in how we do client services work within the organization. And we felt as a gender-based violence organization that's doing work with survivors of trauma, it's important to create a foundation where anything and everything that we do within the organization is coming from a trauma-informed lens and is utilizing trauma-informed care practice structures. So Womankind has been around for about 37 years, and so our primary focus has been to work with the Pan-Asian community, but our services are generally open to everyone. And so this model of practice, though it's catered to communities that identify as collectivistic, meaning their approaches and their styles of work and how they engage the world is from a collectivistic standpoint, the family unit is paramount and important, and the community comes next. And so structures and work and how we behave and how we engage in actions is definitely a primary reason for how we will engage in any form of action. So that mindset is at the foundation of this model. Next slide, please, Avantika. So the model is called Moving Ahead Positively. And it is founded in trauma-informed principles, as I said before. One of the things that we're looking at is we don't believe in this static healing or recovery point when it comes to engaging or experiencing trauma. That the work that, the trauma that a person has experienced has changed or shifted the core identity of an individual. So there's a fundamental shift in the worldview as a result of whatever the trauma experience is. And so the layer of identity has now shifted both physically, emotionally, as well as spiritually. And so how we see ourselves and how we identify as a survivor of trauma and how we now look at the world has fundamentally shifted and fundamentally changed. So when we're working with survivors, we're not necessarily looking to engage in a recovery point, but what we are doing is we're trying to find a way to transcend beyond the trauma. So transcendence for us means that we've kind of figured out or navigated a way that we can build an individualized path to healing. So it means that the power of relationships that I have with my advocate or I have with my family member or the group of people that I'll be working with within the shelter environment is going to help me navigate what's going on with me, whether it's through psychoeducation or whether it's through just constant compassion and care for your well-being, that dynamic is going to be the nexus of where healing can happen. And so when healing happens, there is an ideal sense of internal harmony and a renewed sense of belonging to a community. And the community doesn't necessarily have to be the community that I left as a result of that violence, but it could be a new community that I'm developing. Yes, I can cover the rest in the next 10 minutes. Thank you. Developed a new sense of belonging. So next slide, please. So there are three different components within the model of practice. There are 9 core elements that help us operationalize this, and I'm not going to go into details with that. But one of the 3 points that I wanted to kind of lead, and Peg has mentioned this already, that our purpose is in transcending trauma is that we're a partner and an ally. So I think of the analogy of sitting in a car and the survivor's at the driver's seat and we're actually the passenger sitting alongside. So we're never really making the decisions for the survivor. What we're doing is we're offering options, exploring together consequences of the different options, and then together making collective decision on how we're going to move forward. And then as Peg mentioned before, it's not going to necessarily be a linear process of progress, but there's going to be, what's missing is it's full of progress and setbacks in this, in the second graphic. So there's going to be opportunities where we're going to have to take a step back together and decide, like, is this the right choice for us as a dynamic or within this relationship, and what else can we do to kind of either stop right now and do something else or move forward in a different way. And then finally, the path is ultimately, like I said before, determined by the survivor. We're not the ones that are determining for them. And sometimes I know we feel a little bit of worry that the decisions that are being made are maybe not the right decisions from our point of view, but we have to also sometimes recognize that these are choices that survivors have been making for their entire life at this point to stay safe and to continue to stay safe. And so if these are choices that they're continuing to make, our role would be to kind of stand aside with them and offer the support that would be the most meaningful for them at that time. So next slide, please. So I think there have been a lot of questions that I've seen in the chat talking about practical applications. So I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly, and if there are more questions, we can definitely go through it in the question and answer section. Next slide, please. So there's, I kind of look at how we develop all of our applications within the shelter environment from a communication standpoint. So there's verbal, there's nonverbal, and then there's environmental communication. Environmental communication really is the physical space, right? How is it that we're building the spaces that account for increased sense of privacy? Most of the survivors that we're working with, especially with trafficking survivors, the sense of privacy has been lost. And so the ability to kind of account for their own well-being sometimes means that I have a place that I can call my own where nobody's going to necessarily come in and interrupt my process or interrupt my private time. So one of our shelters is built up to a kind of account for that. Both of our shelters have spaces where you have your own sleeping space, but one of the shortcomings for our program is it's congregate. So the communal spaces are shared, which means the bathrooms and the common areas like kitchens and living room spaces are shared. But what we have done in one of our facilities is we've created more bathrooms within the shelter itself so that more and more survivors can have access to their own bathroom space, especially if you are LGBTQ identifying or navigating a trauma that is really closely related to your gender identity. Increased privacy when it comes to bathroom spaces specifically is going to be super important in you helping you to navigate your healing journey. During our intake process, the other thing that I didn't mention is it's not just physical spaces in terms of accommodations and accessibility. It's also making sure that the wall color is welcoming, inviting. There are signs up that accounts for inclusivity and language access. And then there are affirmations on the wall. And so for our shelters, we have murals that we have residents and volunteer groups paint all over the facility to kind of create a welcoming environment for all the individuals that are residing in the space. Now, from a verbal standpoint, our intake and orientation and enrollment process is where we try to be very transparent about the restrictions that our regulations are placing on us in terms of doing this work, and how is it that we can advocate for or with a survivor if any of these processes or restrictions are creating barriers for them. We also talk about the limitations of confidentiality that we have in our space and how we have to kind of sometimes keep the location of the house very private. And sometimes this can create a lot of barriers for survivors, like I said before, but as much as possible, we are flexible when breaches of confidentiality on the survivor part does happen, by exploring individually what happened in that specific scenario and how is it that we can kind of move forward to continue to protect the house as well as the survivor's safety. Excuse me. Next slide, please. In terms of shelter services, sorry, I'm gonna take a sip of water. In terms of shelter services, one of the things that we've been mindful of is that healing doesn't necessarily have to happen in a verbal dynamic. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a therapy setting. So a lot of our services offer talk therapy, or counseling and case management, regular services, but we also offer a lot of holistic wellness practices. So our Pathways to Healing program, for example, offers acupuncture, yoga, a tea circle, a bunch of arts and crafts activities that kind of account for group processes that doesn't necessarily have to involve any sort of talking, but it does involve the body, mind, spirit connection. And so it's reestablishing the connection that was ruptured or lost as a result of the trauma experience. The other thing that we do is when we're inviting families to come into our houses, the support that we engage in is as a family in a unit structure. So that means that an adult counselor will be working with the head of household, but there will be also a child counselor working with the children in the house. Well, what's happening is there's also group and dyad work that's happening with the parent and the child together. And then there's also a lot of cooperation and collaboration between the two advocates to ensure that the family dynamic is being supported in the most holistic way. And sometimes this involves creating some sort of guidelines or supports for shelter support staff so that they can better also support the family unit. A lot of the rules and policies that we create also, we are ready and willing and always able to kind of be flexible around, so it's not written in strict rule that you have to follow. If we can be flexible, we will always try to be flexible and always try to accommodate, barring that we are in compliance with our state and city regulations. And then the final thing I've already gone through is accounting for accessibility. This means language access needs, so offering telephonic interpretation if possible, interpreters if needed, and then emotional needs. Sometimes it means that like their survivors will sometimes need respite support for, can you take my child for a couple of minutes? I need to kind of be able to do this, engage in self-care. So we would offer supports like that. Now, a lot of our survivors also may have dietary restrictions or observe halal or kosher. And so those are practices also we have incorporated automatically within our program and are always willing to accommodate culturally based on whatever the survivor is requesting of us. I don't know, Avantika, if we have time to go over the case scenario discussion. So I don't know if we should I continue with that?
You could just go ahead and maybe cover what else is left over and not the case scenarios.
Yeah, so
and then
I'm gonna go into, if you can skip ahead to trauma-informed staff support, and then that'll be the end. So we've talked about working with survivors, but I think Peg mentioned this in the beginning. It also means that as an organization, we're trying to be trauma-informed. So this would include looking at what staff support looks like. And so trauma-informed supervision is something that we aspire to. I don't think within the organization we will say that we are experts in this, but I do know that what we actively try to do is engage in supervision that accounts for the core principles that we utilize for services with clients. We will offer those same parallel processes for supervision with our staff. So every one of our staff have weekly supervisions with their direct reports, and in that process they're accounting for not only how you're doing, but also what is it that you would need support in, and what you're doing really well and what's going really great. The other layer of support that we provide is, because it's an emergency shelter and because there's a possibility for law enforcement, adverse parties, or different kind of safety concerns to happen, there's a safety alert policy and procedure guide that we've created for our staff for any contingency. We have a contingency plan essentially for all the different possibilities that could potentially happen in a residential environment. For example, if police come on site, what are you supposed to do? If ICE informants are on site, what are some steps you can take? If there's escalated violence between two residents in the house, what are some steps you can do to de-escalate it and then kind of move forward in supporting both residents? The other layer of support that we've created for our staff is to create a structure of respite for staff. So this means we have an on-call procedure guide where staff can take. We have a very generous benefit package in terms of taking time off. And so in order to accommodate people taking time off, we still have to cover the houses. So we have an on-call process where staff are per diem, and they would come and provide respite support for our staff if they would like to take time off. In addition to that, what we're working on right now is there's a lot of instances where our own biases come into this work, and sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's completely unintentional and we're not even aware we're engaging in it. So our next processes that we're going through in this year is to really look at implicit and explicit biases, and how is it that in doing shelter work with our survivors that where is it that where we need to grow, and where is it that we're doing really well. So that's an ongoing support that we're utilizing a consultant to kind of do a better job in really holistically providing support to our survivors. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much. This was so much information, so many good pointers and material. And as we're wrapping up, I want to also point out a couple of resources moving forward, which is the Freedom Network link to the project, as well as our resource library, where you'll be able to find the recording of this webinar, as well as many other webinars. And of course, you feel free to email us at the email listed as well. And I want to remind you that Avantika has shared that following this, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, and you can also find it there. And of course, we ran out of time. So we have over 1,000 questions that was submitted during registration. And while we're not going to be able to cover all 1,000, we will be following up with a technical assistance hour of question and answer, where we'll cover many of those questions and some of the questions that were asked today. So thank you so much to the speakers and to you for attending.